You wake up one morning, gas prices are higher again, food costs more, interest rates stay elevated, your savings buy less than they did just a few years ago. And most people assume these are isolated problems, but they're not. They are connected. Deep underneath the headlines, underneath the political arguments, underneath the noise of financial television, a structural shift is happening in the global financial order, and almost nobody is talking about the real reason why. Because what's changing right now is bigger than inflation, bigger than oil, bigger than one war. It's about the system the modern world has depended on for over 50 years. A system built on one simple agreement. Oil would be priced in dollars. And that agreement helped create one of the greatest economic advantages any nation has ever had. But history teaches us something important. No monetary system lasts forever. Every reserve currency eventually reaches a turning point. Every empire eventually faces the consequences of debt, conflict, and overextension. And when those shifts happen, they don't happen slowly at first. Then suddenly, everyone feels them at once. What we may be witnessing now is the early stage of that transition. Not the end overnight, but the beginning of a reordering. A world where countries increasingly ask a dangerous question. What happens if we no longer need the dollar the way we once did? And if that question spreads, the effects won't stay in financial markets. They will show up in your grocery bill, your mortgage, your job market, your retirement, your future. So in this video, we're going to break down why the petrodollar system mattered so much, why cracks are beginning to appear, why nations are moving away from dollar dependency, and why ordinary people are already paying the price, even if they don't realize it yet.
But before we begin, if you enjoy deep analysis that helps you understand how money, power, and history actually work, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because the next decade may reshape the global economy more than the last 50 years combined. Now, to understand what's happening today, you first need to understand how the system was built in the first place. After World War II, the United States emerged as the dominant global power. Its industrial capacity was unmatched. Its military strength was unmatched. And perhaps most importantly, its financial position was unmatched. The dollar became the center of the global monetary system. At first, the dollar was tied to gold, but eventually that system became unsustainable. Too much money was being created, too much debt was building, and confidence began to crack. So the system evolved. Instead of backing the dollar with gold, the dollar became indirectly backed by oil. This was one of the most important financial arrangements in modern history, because every country needs energy. And if oil is priced in dollars, then every country needs dollars. That created permanent global demand for US currency. Think about the power of that. The United States could borrow cheaply, run massive deficits, expand debt, print money during crises, and still maintain demand for its currency because the world needed dollars to function. This created extraordinary advantages. But here's the problem with every system built on privilege. Eventually, excess follows. Debt rises faster than productivity. Spending rises faster than income. And financial power begins to depend more on confidence than fundamentals. History shows this repeatedly. The Dutch experienced it, the British experienced it, and every dominant empire eventually reaches the same crossroads. The turning point always begins quietly. At first, very few people notice. Then, geopolitical tensions rise. Trade conflicts emerge. Internal divisions increase. Debt burdens explode. And rival powers begin building alternatives. That's exactly what we're seeing now. Countries around the world are increasingly asking, should we continue depending entirely on one financial system? And once nations begin asking that question seriously, diversification begins. We're seeing more bilateral trade agreements settled outside the dollar. We're seeing central banks buying gold at levels not seen in decades. We're seeing emerging alliances attempting to reduce dependency on Western financial infrastructure. Why? Because countries learned something important over the last several years. Dependence creates vulnerability. When reserves can be frozen, when payment systems can become geopolitical weapons,
When trade access can become conditional, nations naturally begin searching for alternatives. This is not emotional, it is strategic. And once these strategic shifts begin, they tend to continue for years. Now here's where most people misunderstand the situation. The dollar does not collapse overnight. Reserve currencies decline gradually. The process happens in stages. First, trust weakens at the margins. Then diversification increases slowly. Then trade patterns shift. Then capital flows begin changing. And eventually, the structural advantages begin eroding. What makes this dangerous is not one single event. It's the compounding effect. Because the modern global financial system depends heavily on confidence. Confidence in debt markets, confidence in central banks, confidence in governments, confidence that the currency will maintain value. But when debt levels rise too far, governments face impossible choices: raise taxes, cut spending, or print more money. Historically, societies almost always choose monetary debasement in some form because it is politically easier.
But printing money doesn't create wealth. It redistributes wealth, usually away from savers and wage earners toward debtors and asset holders. That's why many people feel poorer even when markets appear strong. The currency itself quietly loses purchasing power, and this becomes especially dangerous during periods of geopolitical fragmentation, because global efficiency declines. Trade becomes more political, supply chains become less stable, energy markets become more volatile, and inflationary pressure becomes harder to control. Now add another layer to this. The world today has more debt than at almost any point in modern history. Governments are deeply leveraged. Corporations are deeply leveraged. Consumers are deeply leveraged. The entire system became dependent on low interest rates and cheap money. But once inflation rises, central banks face a trap. If they raise rates aggressively, debt becomes harder to sustain. If they print money aggressively, inflation accelerates. That's the dilemma. And historically, these periods are rarely smooth. This is why market volatility is increasing. This is why global uncertainty is rising. This is why long-term investors are becoming more focused on preservation rather than pure growth, because they understand something critical. The biggest risk is not daily headlines. The biggest risk is structural transition. Now let's talk about the human side of this, because macroeconomic shifts sound abstract until they hit everyday life. You feel it when rent rises faster than wages. You feel it when groceries cost more each month. You feel it when owning a home becomes harder. You feel it when savings no longer feel safe. Most people think inflation is just prices going up, but inflation is also a reflection of declining purchasing power. And when reserve currency strength weakens over long periods, that process accelerates. This is why financial education matters more now than ever before, because periods like this create both danger and opportunity. Historically, every major transition produces massive wealth destruction for those who don't adapt, and enormous opportunity for those who understand the cycle early. The key is understanding that cycles always exist. Booms create excess. Excess creates instability. Instability creates restructuring, and restructuring creates a new order. This pattern repeats across centuries, not because history repeats perfectly, but because human behavior repeats. Fear repeats, greed repeats, overconfidence repeats, and debt cycles repeat. Now, does this mean collapse is guaranteed? No. Systems are resilient. The dollar remains deeply dominant. The United States still possesses enormous strengths: innovation, capital markets, military reach, and institutional scale. But strength and decline can coexist. That's the part people struggle to understand. A nation can remain powerful while simultaneously experiencing long-term relative weakening. Those two things can happen together. And transitions between world orders are often messy, not linear, not predictable, and usually underestimated until they become obvious. That's why this moment matters, because the world is no longer moving toward greater globalization. It's moving toward fragmentation, toward competing blocks, toward parallel systems, toward strategic independence. And whenever the world fragments economically,
efficiency falls, costs rise, volatility increases. Now here's the most important lesson in all of this. The average person cannot control global monetary policy. They cannot control geopolitical conflict. They cannot control central bank decisions, but they can control how prepared they are. They can study history. They can understand cycles. They can think long-term instead of emotionally. They can build resilience instead of dependency. Because in every major economic transition, the people who survive best are not necessarily the smartest. They are the most adaptable. And adaptability begins with understanding reality clearly, not emotionally, not politically, but structurally. The world is changing. The monetary order is evolving. And whether people realize it or not, the cost is already showing up everywhere around them. Not all at once, but slowly, quietly, persistently, until eventually everyone notices. And by then, the cycle is already far along. That's why understanding these shifts early matters, because history rewards people who prepare before the crowd reacts. If you found this analysis valuable, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone trying to understand where the global economy may be heading next. And remember, the biggest changes in history often begin invisibly, long before the majority realizes the world has already changed.